He hit the stone with the flat of his palm, and all the practiced restraint he had worn like armor for 30 winters shattered into a single animal howl that rolled across the moss and rattled the birches. The name carved there, Maurice Thorne, felt suddenly treacherous, an accusation in granite. Garin Thorne bent until his forehead met cool marble. Tears he had never allowed in council rooms or before the hunting circle, tracing fresh lines down his face. And for a long, terrible heartbeat, he could not name whether it hurt more that she was gone or that she had died with a secret clenched in her lungs. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He would never have come at dusk if duty alone had driven him. The North clans preferred ceremony at dawn, horns and wet graves and the blunt comfort of ritual. Garin had come now because the night had been noisy with memory. Maurice's laugh in the kitchen, the way she'd braid wolf threads into her hair when storms came, and because information had been slipped into the hands of his steward with too many fingers stained by fear to be innocent. He had expected solitude, the predictable dignity that accompanied grief in the North, the respectful distance of betas and widows, a priestess murmuring the old words so the land would forget the sins of men. He had not expected to find a vampire crying. Lucien Voss looked nothing at all like Garin's imagination of a monster. He was all edges softened by long grief, high cheekbones that once might have promised cruelty, but now only catalogued sorrow, hair the color of riverstone, hands that cradled a child with an intimacy Garin recognized only in mothers. He crouched on the cold earth like a man who had been cast down by his own weight, his shoulders shaking in a way that made the air between them intimate and dangerous. The child against his chest was a small, shivering thing with hair like moonlit wheat and eyes too old for her years, dark and luminous and thirsty in a way that made Garin's throat close. "Step away from my daughter's grave," Garin said, the command a blade. It held every creed of the pack in its sharpness: blame, ownership, the inviolable right to mourn on their own terms. The words were meant to make the vampire flinch. Instead, Lucien lowered his head and let the rain of tears continue, the sound small and absurd in the heavy silence of the cemetery. "I am not what you think," Lucien said, when he finally lifted his face, voice like a thing accustomed to being folded into shadows. His eyes, when they met Garin's, carried names of winters before the North clans were named. They held a softness Garin resented with a heat that had nothing to do with the cold. "And you are not what you once were, Alpha." "Do not call me that here," Garin said. He tasted iron, the taste of blood and old oaths, and behind his ribs the animal inside him pressed to be unleashed. "This place is sacred. You have trespassed." Lucien's fingers tightened around the child's small shoulder. Garin noticed, with a sharpness that startled him, the careful restraint of gentleness. The child was gaunt in a way that made Garin think of outcast lambs. Yet her small chest rose and fell with the human rhythm of breath. A newborn vampire should be quiet, Garin thought, silent in hunger, drawn to darkness with a patience vampires kept like a second heart. But this child was tethered to a human cadence. Somewhere along the line, blood had been split and mixed and woven into a dangerous braid. "She is Maurice," Lucien said, and Garin understood the speakers and audiences in that single ragged sentence. The name was a flame both of accusation and of confession. Garin had expected many things from the steward's note: treachery, threats, the slow rot of political corruption. But he had not expected a granddaughter he did not know he had, curled in the arms of the oldest predator he had fought in his youth. "No daughter of mine kept secrets like this," Garin said. The words came like a whip. He had imagined her death as a straight thing, a wound with a yes or no verdict. Not like this. Not as a braid of betrayal with strands that reached back into the treaties his forebears had ironed into the world. "You will give her to me." Lucien laughed then, a small, bitter sound that filled the space between them. "You would take a child like one takes a prize at the hunt," he said. "You would march her into your court and brand her name into your ledger. You call it protection, we call it possession. You are right, Alpha, you do not know what this is." There were shapes behind Garin, like phantoms of decision. The council waiting for his word, the betas who would see this child as an asset, the young wolves in the pack who would see her as a lineage to be used. Garin's authority had always been a currency. Taking the child would solidify his line, repair the hole Maris had left. The pack needed an heir. His personal hunger to hold the last of his blood was not noble, and he knew it. But the idea of Lucien, of a vampire who fed on the night and on the sleeping, raising his blood, Garin felt a prickle like poison under his skin. "You know what she is," he said quietly, because he needed to anchor this moment in facts, in bone-deep truths. Half-blood children do not live long if the curse wakes. She will draw hunters. She will be a beacon for those who still keep the old laws. The packs will send scouts. The covens will smell the scent of power. I will not let my line be used to start a war. Lucien's face folded with a history Garin did not want to see. "Your ancestors made bargains in knives and old wine. They sealed deals with blood meant to secure borders, to keep wolves from howling the wrong names at the wrong moons. There are clauses in those bargains that no one names anymore because naming them invites them to wake. Maris stumbled into one of those clauses. Garin's hand curled into a fist, nails biting skin. He did not know what to be more angry at, that his line had been entangled with secrets before his reign, or that his daughter, Maris, who had left him letters filled with honeyed defiance and childish sketches, had hidden a liaison that birthed a child with stakes he had never imagined. The memory of Maris smiling with a reckless hunger, the way she lingered near border trees where the air smelled of old magics, came back to him in flashes that were sudden as thunder. If she carried a burden that would kill her— "You did not know," Lucien finished gently. "None of you knew." Garin's world, which was made of lines and hierarchies and the blunt arithmetic of power, buckled. The cemetery smelled of wet earth and lichens and the tidings of things that had been kept underground for too long. Why were you here then? Why at her stone? Lucien's thumb rubbed the child's wrist, small and fragile against his knuckles. "Because I owe a debt to what Maris loved," he said. "Because she trusted me once in nights when treaties were hollow promises, and I kept nothing but a promise to the girl with the wolf laugh, who would sometimes sit by the river and hand me bread, because she thought hunger could be fed by small mercies." He smiled at a memory that Garin had no claim to, and it cut like a blade. "You think I am a liar because I'm ancient," Lucien said. "You think I hold longevity like a ledger, counting names and favors and betrayals. I have hoarded a lot, Alpha, but there are things I would put down a century for. I came because Maris's child needed someone who understood blood." The child made a small sound then, a hiccup of hunger that spoke of complicated needs. Lucien flinched and then pulled the girl's hair back to reveal a pale throat, then covered it as if shielding the place from Garin's view. Garin had fought vampires before. He'd seen the flash of fangs and the cruel efficiency of hunger. But it was the child's eyes that arrested him, old beyond her years, wearied by something too heavy for a child's shoulders, yet fiercely bright with a curiosity that regarded Garin not as a king, but as a man who might either crush her or hold her. "You cannot name an heir if she dies," Lucien said, "and you cannot claim her if she is a beacon. If you drag her into a court that does not know the old clauses of the pacts, if you parade her blood like proof of lineage without understanding what it awoke, you will doom her. You will doom yourself." Garin's breath fogged in the air. He tasted defiance and grief and a strange yearning tenderness that had nothing to do with the politics of power. "You are asking me to consider that you, a vampire with a history of breaking treaties, are the protector of my blood?" Lucien's laugh was soft and unflinching. "I am asking you to consider that Maris trusted me with a secret she did not tell her father," he said. "I am asking you to consider that the thing that killed her did not die with her, and that if you claim the child, you will unravel what remains of our fragile peace." For a long moment, the wind carried only the sound of the dead and the living breathing in the same thin space. Garin thought of the council room, of the faces that would harden at the mention of a vampire child, of priests who would chant for the child to be delivered, of hunters whose hands itched for the scent of blood, and who would wear that child's life like armor. He thought of the pack's need for continuity, and the way his own heart had hollowed with pride and regret in equal measure since Marissa's death. "Leave her with me for the night," Lucien said suddenly, and there was a plea beneath his words that Garin did not expect. "I can keep her safe until dawn. The covens watch less in daylight. Let me prove to you there is reason to listen." Garin's first instinct, the animals, was to tear the vampire apart. His second thought, more complicated and more human, was of the child and how little she had left of family. The pack would judge him if he wavered. They would call it weakness. They would scour the borders for enemies to blame instead of asking who had made the pacts. To take the child now would be to seize power. To leave her now would be to risk losing her. His fingers brushed the granite where Marissa's name lay like a fault line. He wanted to command, to make a decree that would end the night and rally the court. But standing in the cemetery, with dusk eating the trees and Lucien's hand steady as prayer, he found himself held in place by a feeling older than law, the sudden, tender need to protect what remained of the daughter who had once danced with rain across the riverbanks. "One night," Garin said finally, and the words surprised both of them by its softness. "Dawn, and then you tell me the truth. If there is any deception." "Any," Lucien echoed. Garin could see how the word clung to them. Contract, promise, the brittle fabric of bargains. He was an alpha bound by oaths. So was Lucien, though his oaths were inked in blood and regret. Neither of them, Garin thought, could afford to break the things that kept the fragile peace. As they stood in the half-light, a cold breeze ghosted over the graveyard, bringing with it a scent Garin had not expected. Old iron and lavender, and the faint tang of something old as law. He felt suddenly like a man who had stumbled into a room where a truth was seated like an unwelcome guest, and could not yet choose whether to embrace it or kill it. The night outside the boundary of the North clans was full of ears and of teeth. Dawn would bring questions he could not unask. But for the sliver of time before the moon sank, he allowed himself the thin, dangerous luxury of one small concession to tenderness. To keep his daughter, if only for a night, in the arms of the enemy he had loved to hate. The decision was made not in triumph, but in an ache that felt suspiciously like hope. Lucien carried the child across the cemetery with a carefulness that made Garin's knuckles taut. He walked like a man carrying a lit thing he had no right to touch, gentle, reverent, as if a single misstep could snuff something irrevocably fragile. Garin followed, every sense tuned to the old rhythms of threat and territory. Even his grief had sharpened into a weapon, a readiness to split the night if need be. They crossed the gate without ceremony. The lamps along the path were sputtering mirrors of the moon. The world beyond the graveyard smelled of riverbeds and old treaties, that bitter scent Garin had learned to read as clearly as a pack's wariness. Lucian's house was built of stone and shadow, a place that remembered storms and the footfalls of centuries. Inside, it was warm in a way Garin expected to mistrust. Knitted blankets, bowls of food placed out like offerings, a small brass cradle lined with wool dyed the color of ash. Lucian did not offer Garin a chair. He propped the child on pillows and tended to her with a tenderness that unsettled Garin more than any threat had. There was a delicate reverence in how Lucian checked the pulse at the child's throat, how he murmured nonsense syllables to coax a frightened breath, how he brushed the moonlit hair back from a pale forehead. It felt like watching a wolf feed its pup, private, intense, loaded with rules Garin did not know. "She refuses Milt," Lucian said quietly, as if confessing to a fault. "Some half-blood children are born stubborn." Garin wanted to bark an order, give her human nourishment, get healers, inform the council. He wanted the certainty of rituals, oaths invoked, names pronounced, men with clear faces and clearer answers. Instead, he watched the child's eyelids flicker. When she slept, her hands curled and flexed as if on the edges of a memory she could not name. The smallness of her made Garin feel suddenly like a thief in his own life. Morris's handwriting climbed on the inside of his skull, scribbled lists, recipes, a crude map of a place she loved. He wanted those things back the way other men wanted gold or trophies. He wanted to stitch absence into meaning with commands and proclamations. Lucian's quiet was an accusation. "Tell me about the pact," Garin said, when the child drifted into a fragile sleep. The question came out rougher than he intended, less a request than an incantation he hoped might unbind the night. Lucian's face folded. He moved to the window and drew the curtain in 2 slow breaths, then turned, the room retreating into dimness around him. "Not all bargains were made for reasons of immediate gain," he said. "Your ancestors, there were winters when the wolves needed more teeth than law could give them. They stood at the edges of other realms and cut deals with what they believed would secure them. There were clauses, winding like a river under ice, that involved bloodlines being offered as seals." Garin's jaw tightened. He had heard whispers on long nights, hints of trades struck in desperation, of wolf leaders who had sworn away names to keep hunger at bay. He had not let himself listen when the rumors named his own line. "You speak as if they were bargains with ghosts," he said. "They were words. Men can break their words." "But men can also be bound," Lucian said, "and blood remembers what oaths do not. Morris loved recklessness and the wrong kinds of nights. She wandered where she shouldn't have, and she loved someone who belonged to the coven as the packs belonged to the land." He let the sentence rest like a stone placed between them. "The child carries that crossing." Garin's hands fisted again. The thought of Maris with another, especially one who belonged to the coven, was a fresh twist of salt in old wounds. He imagined her laughing with teeth exposed, a laugh that had been both challenge and invitation, and the image made his chest ache. He wanted answers he could pin down, names he could hate or punish. Lucian avoided the specifics as if his mouth were afraid of waking ghosts. "Why the curse?" Garin demanded. Did they mark her? Did they mean for Maris to die?" Lucian's mouth twisted. "I will not flatter you with a neat villain," he said. "The curse is older than covens. It is part law, part superstition, part bargain gone bad. It binds itself to blood as a reminder. Dare to tie yourself too tightly to the old powers, and the web will take a life to rebalance itself. Maris stumbled into a knot none of you knew existed, and that knot waits, greedy and patient. If the child grows into what the pact recognizes, it will try to reclaim its price. Garen's shoulders slumped with a weight he recognized not as his own, but as ancestral. He thought of Maris dying alone, the way she had written to say she would be gone a while, that she had found something she couldn't explain. He saw the letter's last line again, "Keep the kettle warm for me," and felt the barbaric uselessness of requests that meant nothing in the face of old laws. "If the pact is in our blood," he said finally, "then this child is our responsibility." Responsibility, Lucien echoed, or liability. They argued in the language of men who had built their lives on dominion, duty, claim, the safety of the pack. But beneath the exchange was a different currency, shame and the soft ache of parenthood. Lucien told Garen things he would have told no other, things about nights when Maris had sat on his windowsill and asked him how to be brave, about the way she had liked to split bread with foxes. Garen shared, reluctantly, the small humiliations of a father who had loved his daughter in the blunt ways of a ruler, less tender, more protective, like a man who feeds his kin by deciding where they hunt. In those moments, they seemed less like archetypes and more like two grieving people groping in the dark for a light neither could be sure of. Morning crept toward them with the slow determination of tide. The house settled into a brittle quiet. Garen's armor remained present, but it had found a crack, an opening that felt perilously like softness. He watched Lucien when he thought the vampire did not know, cataloging the foreign tenderness on his face. It did something cruel inside Garen, a mixture of envy and fear. He had been an alpha since his hair had begun to silver. Authority had been the thing that kept him whole. Watching another man tend what was left of his blood without ceremony, Garen realized he had allowed himself to forget the way hands can speak when words fail. The first complication came not from the coven or the pack, but from the air. The scent of wolves, not of Garen's, but foreign and quick, scouts with a question in their tread. Lucien froze, then moved to the window with silent, practiced motion. Garen was at his shoulder before he knew it, the alpha's instincts humming like a string about to snap. "Rivals," Lucien said. "They smell change on you. They will suspect a weakness in your line and test it." Garen felt the familiar flare of anger at anyone who would dare pry at his family, at those who would use his grief to carve advantage. "What do they want?" he asked. "To see what you do," Lucien said. "To decide whether your hand can be forced." He cupped the child's face with the gentleness of a man who had known too many broken things. "If you take her without understanding, you invite them to take what remains." Garen hated the thought. He hated being played for sympathy or weakness. He had to make decisions that kept the pack whole, that ensured survival in a world where cunning often outlived ferocity. "We will not let them take her," he said. "If they come to my border, they will find a wolf king who will not bend." They spent the morning in a wary truce. Lucien set traps around the house, simple wards, sigils that smelled of iron and old herbs. Garen summoned 2 trusted betas without fanfare. They arrived with weapons and questions and the look of men who wanted orders. Neither side relaxed. There was the constant tension of strangers pretending to be allies because misfortune demanded it. As the day advanced, the child stirred more often, scents and sounds upsetting a fragile calm. She found Garen's hand when he sat too close, small fingers closing on fingers that once held her mother's. The touch sent a flare of something raw and unnameable through him. His hand did not withdraw. As twilight thinned into night again, Lucian pushed a bowl toward Garin. It contained pages, old treaties, charred at the edges, ink faded to the color of russet bark. "Read," Lucian said simply. "If you are to claim her, you must know your debt." Garin read by the meager light of a lamp, the letters of foreign geography. The clauses were written in cramped, impassioned hands, names of leaders, of witness marks, of punishments. He recognized family names, ancestors, painted in the strokes of those who had feared hunger more than shame. The treaty spoke of boundaries, of tribute, and of a clause shadowed in the margin, a seal of lineage that would be activated when bloodlines crossed a certain threshold. The language was oblique, but enough was clear. The pact had been meant as protection in a savage winter. Instead, it had been a curdled bargain that would, if stirred, exact a life. "This is why they silence priests on the Coven side," Lucian said. "Because priests are the keepers of names, and names wake things. Your forebears hoped only to bind the wolves. They invited consequence instead." Garin slammed the page closed, the sound like a bone cracking. "Why was this never brought to council?" he demanded. "Why keep this secret?" "Because it was shameful," Lucian said. "Because admitting the bargain was admitting a moral bankruptcy. And because when things are written as necessity, it is easier to let the next generation eat the consequences." They traded barbs that night, but underneath, the pain was honest. Garin admitted, harshly and to his own surprise, how he had failed Maris after her mother died, how he had been a father more administrative than attentive, a man who thought love could be rationed like supplies. Lucian confessed to being a witness to Maris's softer truths, the way she'd guarded curiosities like small rebellions. In telling one another, they were not making peace, but carving a fragile island of shared accountability in a sea that wanted to consume them all. Yet the night did not stay still. Halfway through the dark, the child's eyes opened, not with the fugue of sleep, but clear and sharp, as if she had been listening through the walls. She reached for Lucian with a force that surprised them both, and the skin along her wrist flashed, a pale sigil, almost imperceptible, like a bruise forming in a pattern. Lucian's breath hitched as if winded by a blade. Garin saw the mark with a shock that felt like ice. A spiral, thin and old, as if drawn by a hand that remembered older magics. "She carries it," Lucian whispered. Garin's fingers, which had spent decades on hilts and ledgers, trembled. To see a symbol, the bound shape of a curse, on Marissa's daughter's skin was to feel the pact's teeth close. The child's small face contorted in a way that was not quite pain and not quite hunger. Lucian pressed a palm over the mark as if shielding it, and for a moment Garin thought the vampire would start bleeding grief onto the pillow rather than the child. They were not alone in learning the mark. Outside, in the hedgerows that divided clanlands, someone with a keen nose and a quicker tongue must have spied a new scent, because a shadow detached from the trees and moved toward the house with the sound of leather and steel. Garin's bade us tend, and the air filled with a pre-battle stillness. The night had folded the world into a single decision: hold or hand over. Lucian's eyes met Garin's without show. "If the mark wakes," he said, "it will call more than men. It will call the old watchers, and they do not bargain like men. You will see not treaties rewritten, but names erased." Garin felt the iron in his chest, its pull as old as his line. He could not let the mark be a summons. He could not allow his line to be threatened by a thing born of his ancestors' cowardice. He could not ignore the child either. The paradox wrapped itself around him like a noose, and the choice he had to make loomed. Seize the child to protect her, by control, risking the awakening of darker forces through ignorance and ceremony, Or stand with Lucien, admit a debt he had never wanted to admit, and risk being seen as weak by those who defined him. The shadow at the door shifted, and a voice called, a scout, blunt and accusatory, demanding to know why Garin Thorn sheltered a coven child. The betas bristled. Lucien's hands tightened on the child's blanket. Garin thought of the faces in the council room that would harden at the news, of hunters sharpening blades with purpose. He thought of Maris's smile and of the way she had trusted wrong knights. He thought of the spiral on the child's wrist, its old hunger curled like a sleeping serpent. "Tell them to wait," Garin said, and his voice was the voice of command that had always moved men like flint. "Tonight we keep her. Dawn will bring answers." The scout's voice protested. The night outside was a chorus of impatience. A mark, a child, a vampire in a house. Rumors were already a tinderbox. Garin's decision would be judged in the light of morning. For now, the two sworn enemies stood together inside a small house, holding the last of a daughter's laughter like something that could either warm or burn them. The choice had been made in an instant that felt both reckless and necessary. But as Lucien's fingers smoothed the child's hair, and Garin felt the old king armor flex with a strain he could not name, both men understood the truth that would shape the days to come. Mercy was not merely a weakness to be exploited. It could be a weapon if wielded with courage. And to wield it, they would have to trust one another enough to let down guards old as lineage. Outside, under the indifferent moon, boots shifted in the hedgerow like hungry promises. Inside, what remained of a family, two broken patriarchs and a child with a spiral on her skin, waited for the dawn to decide what kind of world they would make of the truth. The hedge snapped like a thin thing under a boot, and the front door shuddered as if someone had pushed at the world to see whether it would give. Garin's hand went to his belt by old reflex. The room smelled suddenly of cold iron and of betrayal. The betas moved with the economy of trained wolves, weapons sliding from sheaths. The child in Lucien's lap made a small sound that was half sigh and half question. She did not yet know that the world would bargain over her life. A voice came then, flat and precise, the steward's voice Garin had trusted since before most of his teeth fell out. "Alpha, you must return the child. You do not own what the treaties owned." There was a politeness in it like a blade wrapped in a clean cloth. Something in Garin's chest snapped, not with pain, but with the old animal need to mark where his line had been touched. He recognized the cadence of men who hid self-interest in the language of law. He had learned to hate it as surely as he loved order. He turned, expecting to see the steward's angle, calculating, careful, and instead saw Roland, his second-in-command, stepping through the doorway with a face like flint. Roland's jaw was set, his eyes glittered with righteous hunger. "You will hand her over," Roland said, and the sentence was a command and a verdict at once. He advanced with the confidence of a man who had decided the future. The pack must decide. We cannot be held hostage by treaties written by cowards. Garin felt the room tilt. Roland had always been sharp, too sharp for a man in love with the bluntness of loyalty. He had always wanted the crown to be a stair to be climbed, not a burden. Garin saw it now, the hunger of men who would use a child's bloodline to polish their own names. He heard, beneath Roland's words, the whisper of challengers sharpening knives on teeth. "Back," Garin said, but his command carried a hollowness that Roland's eyes ate for breakfast. "Tonight we keep her. Dawn will bring counsel." Roland laughed then, not a laugh of mirth, but of contempt made visible. "You think you can keep secrets between the walls of your grief? There are those of us who have waited for your weakness to be useful. There are those who would see your line strengthened, and those who would see you fall. He spread his hands as if showing them a map of inevitable consequence. This is not a matter to bargain with a vampire. Lucien's fingers tightened around the child's blanket. Garin saw the ghost of a bruise cross the vampire's knuckles where some long-ago hand had struck him. He saw the quiet decision in the man's face. "This child is not a bargaining chip," Lucien said. His voice was low, and the room, as if it had ears in its walls, listened. It should have been enough. Garin expected his betas to fall into line, to follow his voice like birds follow a hawk. But Roland moved with the arrogance of a man who had already corralled the future. Two younger wolves, faces hard with the hunger of men who wanted to see the pack rise, closed in behind him. They did not look like conspirators warmed by treachery. They looked like sons of the land who believed their righteousness justified any theft. "You are weak, Garin," Roland said, inscrutable and certain. "You talk of mercy as if it were a tool rather than a sin. You have been an alpha so long you have forgotten how to be a leader." Garin felt an ancient part of himself, older than crown, older than territory, go cold. This was not about law. This was about power pressed into the shape of a child's throat. He stepped forward, a single motion, and would have struck Roland if not for Lucien's voice slicing across the room. "Do you want her blood on your hands, Roland? Do you think the gods care for your rise as you cut a child's skin?" Lucien's calm had sharpened into something like warning. He spoke not to beg, but to ignite conscience like tinder. And for a brief second, Garin saw the younger men shift, the possibility of conscience passing like a shadow. Roland's face hardened. "You and your rhetoric," he spat. "You are not of us. You speak for monsters." The insult landed not only as a claim, but as a revocation of everything Lucien had been trying to hold together. Whatever fragile trust had been building between the two leaders fractured like thin glass. Garin's hand went to his throat, not to choke, but as if to pull the line of command back around him. He tasted copper, and the memory of Marissa's voice telling him to be kinder with his hands. He thought, with a sudden incendiary clarity, of the letter he'd found in his daughter's trunk months ago. Edges worn, a name scratched on the inside, R. He had dismissed it in his grief as a child's game. He had not wanted to inventory who hurt her. "Stand down," Garin ordered, voice like frozen steel. "This is not the night." Roland's smile was a sliver of something Garin had once forgiven, a boy's ambition masking as a storm. "You will not order me to sleep," Roland said. He lifted his chin like a man ready to split a kingdom with one blow. "Take the child to the council. Let them decide the terms of the line. We will not let our future be the curiosity of covens and old monsters." At the word council, the room seemed to inhale. Garin felt the old codes shifting, the law invoked by men who had never had to choose between fatherhood and rulership. He wanted to drag the boy by his collar, to beat the treachery from him, and to show the pack what hunger looks like in a father's face. But he also knew that violence now would not resolve anything. It would only fracture what remained of his authority. The thought lodged like a thorn. If he forced Roland, would the pack see him as a tyrant? If he let Roland lead, would the pack be steered into a war of hunger and blood? Lucien moved then, swift and absurdly human in the suddenness of his action. He stepped between Roland and the child and put his hand flat on the boy's chest. "If you take her to the council," he said, his voice so quiet it might have been private, "you will spell doom not for this girl, but for your own names. You will wake obligations that will not stop at politics." Roland's face went rigid with anger. You speak of obligations as if you are not the one who has fed on us for centuries, he said. You think you have the right to teach us about consequences? Lucian's mouth twisted with a memory. I have lived long enough to watch men make the same mistakes 3 times over, he said. I have watched packs break themselves on the horns of pride. This child, your granddaughter, does not belong in tomorrow's ledger. The accusation that flung itself between them was a different sort of betrayal. Garen's heart recoiled when he realized the shape of it. Roland had not only wanted power, Roland had had dealings. The steward's polite voice from the doorway supplied the missing thread with a casual cruelty. Alpha, some of us have been given promises by those who would see the pack prosper. Treaties are devices, allegiances shift. The child will be useful. Garen's breath came shallow. He could feel the old architecture of rule, the way favors are tallied, the way men who feel small grow large on the consumption of someone else's pain, fold into place. He was not blind to the way the pack needed strength, but it had never needed the scandal of selling its soul. "Roland," Garen said, the word a summons, "have you been in league with the council to birth this plan?" Roland laughed, a sound without humor. "I have been in league with survival, Alpha. Can't you see? With this child, we secure our line. With this child, we bargain fortunes and make allies. What did Morris do if not choose wrong? We will not let her mistakes dictate our future." The betrayal in Roland's tone landed with a physical thump. Garen thought of Morris, of the things she had kept secret in the pockets of dresses, of the letters she had folded and tucked like small rebellions. He had thought her privacy harmless, teenage mischief. He had not imagined that privacy could be harvested like a crop by men who wanted to climb. Something inside Garen uncoiled like a spring. He had always been a man of order who tolerated dissent, but he had never forgiven treachery that wore the guise of righteousness. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Roland until the man's breath was a ragged thing against his face. "You will lay down your weapons," Garen said, and the authority in his voice was the authority of a man who could no longer afford to be gentle. "You will leave my house. You will not speak of this to the pack." Roland's eyes flamed. "I will not be controlled by the whims of your grief," he said. Then, like the breaking of ice, the room exploded. Roland lunged. The younger wolves moved as if on a signal, and the betas took positions that split loyalty like a blade. For a heartbeat, the house became a battlefield of old muscles and newer betrayals. Fists, a knife glinting, Lucian's movements a blur of practiced defense that betrayed centuries of knowing how to protect what is weak. Garen moved with the blunt force of an older fighter, no finesse, but every hit weighted by a life of survival. He struck Roland hard enough to stagger him. He heard bone complain. Roland rose again, enraged and dangerous. The child screamed, an animal sound that tore through Garen like something hungry. Lucian pressed himself over her like a shield made of shadow and flesh, and Garen saw something that shocked him into a new kind of rage. The vampire bared fangs in a defense so absolute it redefined the predator's face. The younger wolves, seeing their chosen path marred by blood and fear, hesitated. A quiet voice from the doorway, the steward's, spoke then, too calm to be innocent. "Alpha, you cannot let this house hold the child any longer. The council will not abide your private interferences." Garen looked at him and felt a sickness peel at his insides. The steward had always been his manager of men and mundane things. To find him now a whisperer of treachery was an arrow to the heart. Garen's vision narrowed to one dreadful possibility. Maris had loved dangerously and had trusted the wrong men. Those men, grown cleverer and harder, had turned her secret into leverage. He slapped his palm onto the table and made a sound like a struck bell. "Enough!" he roared. The room fell as if someone had cued the silence. "We do this my way. Not for power, not for ledger, for Maris." Roland sneered. "And what is Maris to you? A memory you cling to while we starve? No, we are pragmatic." Garen's eyes burned. "Maris was my daughter," he said, the words finally finding their rightness. "She was reckless, she was flawed, she was more alive than many who have sat in this court. I will not let her be traded like a ledger entry." Lucien's hand left the child's blanket and curled into Garen's, a tight confinement of fingers that said more than words. For a moment, Garen felt the touch of a man who had looked after his girl in ways the Alpha had not known to. The gesture cracked something loose in him. The fragile possibility of alliance with his enemy reappeared like a sunrise behind storm clouds. But the fracture had been made. Where there had been an uneasy truce, there were now lines drawn in the dirt. Roland's ambition and Garen's conscience, the steward's whisperings and the child's small life. Men who thought the world could be bent to their will had chosen sides. Trust, already fragile, lay like glass underfoot. The pack's unity, what remained of it, had a splinter running through it. Outside, in the dark, someone threw a stone at the window. The sound was a single punctuation mark that said the night would not end peacefully. Garen turned to Lucien, to the child, and felt for the first time the terrible knowledge that this fight was not simply over custody or pride. It was about futures, about whether descendants of wolves would be forced to become soldiers, and whether a vampire could be trusted to be more than a predator. Lucien's knuckles whitened. "There will be more," he said quietly. "If they learn of the mark, the covens will come. If Roland moves his pawns in the council, the packs will doubt you. You must choose. Will you hold with me against the old things? Or will you let them take her and become the thing that history remembers as cowardice?" Garen could feel the world narrowing to the size of the room, to the child's small breathing, to the charged faces of men who chose to hunger or to protect. His choices had always been measured in territory and lineage. Tonight, the measure was a small life and the echo of a daughter's laugh. He closed his eyes and thought of Maris sitting by the river, daring the wind to teach her more than fear. "I choose her," he said finally, and the words landed like the strike of a bell. They were not a blanket of solution, but they were a declaration of a father's tenderness, of a king who would risk his name, of a man who had decided to keep one fragile thing intact. It was not an answer to all the fractures, but it was a promise. Roland spat, disgusted and defiant. "Then you choose to stand alone," he said. Garen's answer was not immediate. It did not need to be. The room hummed with the electricity of broken alliances. Men would now judge him, for mercy, for weakness, for choosing a vampire's word over a council's hunger. But inside, Garen felt the small presence of Maris' child like a lodestone. Between the rifts, there was a possibility, dangerous and luminous, that by protecting her, he might force the pack to reckon with the pacts that had birthed the curse. It would mean war with some and peace with others. It might mean his name would be smeared in council minutes. It might mean he would have to step down. It might mean he would have to bind himself in ways older than law. Outside the house, the night thickened, and the sound of boots thudded like a drumbeat of consequences. Inside, Lucien hunched over the child, wounded in ways that the younger men could not imagine. Garen watched Lucien with a fierceness he had not known he possessed. He had arrived at the grave with nothing but the worn armor of an alpha. Now he realized that what he would need was not the full weight of law, but a willingness to be seen as something softer, and perhaps that softness could be sharpened into a weapon. The fractures had opened. Secrets had bled into light. Men had chosen sides. In the wake of the night's violence, all that remained was the small, breathing thing between them, Maris' daughter, whose life might be the hinge upon which the entire NorthClan's future turned. The first pieces had fallen. The rest would be brutal. They came then, not in numbers at first, but as a tide of boots and petitions, the council convening like vultures with sanctimonious faces. Word travels in ways no man plans. Roland had preferred speed and rumor, and the pack answered his summons like thunder. Garen met them in the yard as they pressed against his threshold, old allies with new doubts, betas wearing obligation like armor, hunters with eyes that tasted of opportunity. The moon cast the yard in white grief. Lucian stood with the child tucked to his chest, a dark island amid the tide of wolf forms. The sight of them together, vampire and granddaughter, predator and last of a line, made something inside Garen split open and bleed a fierce, steady resolve. Roland moved among them like a commander scenting victory. "He hides a coven child," he told the crowd, voice tuned for outrage. "He would have us bow to old bargains and foreign beasts. Are we to be ruled by fear?" "A child is not a thing to be bartered," Lucian replied, and his voice traveled through the yard with a shock of unexpected warmth. "She is human in heart, wolf in blood, and she needs guardians, not judges." The beta shifted. Some faces softened, remembering a cub's first tumble. Others tightened like a wire. Garen stepped forward, and the hush that followed felt less like respect than the pack sensing a linchpin shift. His throat worked. His grief answered the crowd's hunger with something the crown had not taught him: humility. "I am her kin," he said. "She is my blood. We will not sell her. She will not be used to climb the shoulders of men." The words landed with the force of a verdict. Roland snarled. Some in the crowd cheered. Garen could feel the fissure widen. Some would follow him for loyalty, others for fear, and a few for the slim chance of favor. Roland stepped forward, hand on the hilt of a blade. "Then we will see if you have the courage to stand alone, Father." The word, father, cut through Garen with a nakedness that undid his practiced control. He had been a leader before a man to his child, and now the two demanded reckoning. He met Roland's challenge not with words, but with an action that startled even himself. He turned his back to the pack and folded his hands over the child's small form where Lucian had settled her into his arms for a moment. It was a public trust placed across enemy borders, and it was, in itself, a soft defiance. "If you seek violence under my roof," Garen said, voice iron-calmed, "you break the laws I once kept. You will not have my sanction. Lay down your blades." A murmur rose like small animals. It took more than commands to sway those who had long found comfort in the simplicity of conquest. For a tense heartbeat, it looked as if the yard would ignite. Then Lucian did something no treaty foreseen. He stepped forward and offered the pack a bargain not of blood, but of service. "I will exchange my loyalty for her safety," Lucian said, and his pledge was a currency unfamiliar and dangerous. "You want lineage? You will have it complete with knowledge and protection. I will stand between this child and whatever old thing wakes for as long as breath holds me. No one flinched from the audacity. The air tasted of salt and the iron of possibility. Roland spat at the offer. You? You would bind yourself to us? You would lie beneath a wolf's banner? His voice was a weapon poised to divide. Lucien's eyes, ancient and clear, slid to Garin. "I will do what she needs," he said simply, "even if it costs me what I have." The words landed like the clanging of an invisible bell. They had the authority of someone willing to stake a lifetime, an immortal's currency. Garin felt the room narrow to the size of a single breath. He could have refused Lucien, demanded the child's custody, driven the old vampire from his lands and reasserted dominance. To do so would be to trade tenderness for sovereignty, to make the child a symbol instead of a person. Instead, Garin stepped beside Lucien shoulder to shoulder and made his choice visible like a blade held up to the moon. "If you take her," Garin said to the pack, "you will not take her as trophy. You will take responsibility. There will be no bargaining. There will be no deals that sell her life for glory. If any of you step out of line, you will answer to me and to the blood you would have tarnished." It was not a surrender, it was a recalibration. He named boundaries and he named consequences. He wore vulnerability like armor. The pack could not fully accept it, but some lowered their blades, the first small capitulations of hearts learning mercy. Roland did not lower his sword. Instead, he attacked, not with the pack, but with treachery. He had men who obeyed the hunger for change, and as Garin spoke, one of Roland's followers slipped away like a shadow and fired a bolt from a crossbow, aimed not at Roland, but at the child. The crack of wood and a whistled death carved the air. The bolt found its mark in a way nothing had in Garin's life. It pierced the arm of the child, not with mortal intent, but at a place where bone did not heal as men did. The air went brittle. The small body convulsed, eyes rolling back, the spiral marking along her wrist burning like a candle. Lucien's roar split the night, not a sound of fury, but of ancestral sorrow. He moved faster than Garin's memory could place, catching the child as she fell, cradling her against a chest that he opened with 2 hands, palms flat against an exposed throat. The vampire's mouth hovered over the tiny wound, and Garin understood, with a collision of horror and awe, what the old ones had feared, that Lucien would feed. "No," Garin said, a stifled command born of all the laws he'd ever kept. He could not name why the thought of a vampire touching his granddaughter's bleeding skin made something inside him revolt. But the child shuddered and then steadied as the vampire drank, not to satiate hunger, but in a precise ritualistic way that looked agonizingly like revival. Lucien's face moved through a geography of pain that Garin had no right to witness, like a man paying a debt in flesh. The wound knitted under Lucien's lips as if the vampire's mouth sewed whatever the bolt had torn. The child inhaled, slow at first, then growing strong. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Garin not as a king, but as a grandfather. And Garin felt a new and terrible tenderness that dissolved his remaining defenses. Roland's follower had been seized by the betas in the confusion and now lay coughing on the porch, hands down. Roland himself, seeing his plan unspool, moved to strike Garin, but found the Alpha's fist already raised. They fought with a violence that smelled of old alliances collapsing, until Garin, exhausted and ferocious, wrested Roland to the ground, and spared him only by binding his wrists and offering him a final mercy, exile or execution, a choice for a man who had made his bed with treachery. When the blood settled and the throng dispersed in a murmur of fear and constrained allegiance, the yard emptied like a stage after a bad play. Garin stood with Lucien beneath the moon, the child's breath even, and her small hand curled in Lucien's fingers. The vampire looked drained in a way Garin had only ever seen on men who had burned too many bridges. Older for having risked a thing no immortal risked without reason. "You bled for her," Garin said, the sentence less accusation than observation. He thought of the taste of marrow and regret that must reside in Lucien's long memory. Lucien's laugh was a broken thing. "I bled for a promise I made to a girl who fed me bread by the river," he said. "I bled for Maris." The name was a small earthquake between them. Garin's knees wanted to give. He forced them steady with a father's stubbornness. "You could have walked away," he said, not made a question, but a concession. "I could not," Lucien replied. "Not when she looked like that. Not when the spiral burned." They stood in silence, two predators whose definitions had been remade by a child. The moon slid over them like a slow benediction. Lucien lifted the child to Garin with a tenderness that made Ren his hands tremble. "She will need you," Lucien said. "She will need a place where both the moon and the hearth are honored. I will teach her the ways of blood and night. You will teach her the ways of pack and dawn. He hesitated as if the word threatened him, then finished. We will keep her." The admission hung in the air like a binding spell. Garin's throat closed. The kind of victory he had always wanted curdled into something softer and infinitely more dangerous. Shared custody, shared power, a joint guard against ancient contracts. It demanded public disavowal of old arrogance and a private admission of need. He reached into Lucien's hand and put his own across the child's small back. The contact, simple and human, trembled with the enormity of the bargain. "Then we bind it," Garin said. "Not as law alone, but as blood and vow. We will unweave the old clauses together. We will find the witch who wrote the margins and drag her into daylight." Lucien's eyes flashed. Relief, surprise, something like hope. "You would do that?" he asked, voice small. "For her," Garin said. "For Maris. For whatever is left of us that still remembers mercy." The choice was not without cost. Roland would be banished at dawn. The steward would be questioned. The council would either placated or broken. Garin's name might fracture in the annals of his people. But as he stood beneath a moon that had witnessed generations, holding his granddaughter close, he felt the old crown lighter for the first time. He had traded absolute control for a hand to hold in the dark, and it felt like the most dangerous, honest kind of rule. Lucien stepped back, a sacrifice already in his posture. "I will stay," he said, "but some of my kind will not like it. They will demand payment. I will be vulnerable." Garin met that vulnerability with something he could not have given before, an offer of protection that was more than a command. "Then take my name when it serves you," Garin said. "Use the pack's shelter when night comes. We will teach your shadows not to hunt our children, and you will teach ours how to listen when hunger whispers." Lucien inclined his head, the briefest of bows. In that small movement, a truce was sealed more intimate than any treaty, a joining of two kinds of guardianship, blood pledged to blood. The child stirred and opened her eyes, looking between them like a small, luminous judge. She reached for both men without hesitation, and when her fingers closed around Garin's thumb and Lucien's index, the thread that had once threatened to choke them knotted into something that might hold. A sacrifice had been made. Lucien's safety, Garin's unchallengeable authority, Roland's political future. But what bloomed in the hollow they left was unexpected. A new covenant forged in grief, not for the sake of power, but for the sake of a girl's breath. The night softened as if acknowledging the change. The moon seemed to steady in its arc, and for the first time since Maris Stone had been struck, Garin allowed himself to imagine a morning where politicking and paternal tenderness could coexist. They would unweave the curse together, he knew. The witch, the old clauses, the teeth of old law. It would be brutal and costly, and might demand of them things they could not yet see. But in the yard, under the indifferent stars, two enemies turned reluctant guardians, and a child with a spiral on her skin made a new geometry of family. It was not a clean victory. It was messy and honest, and perhaps redeeming. Garin bowed his head and let the moon wash his face. When he looked up again, the yard had emptied of many, but a few faces lingered, those who had chosen to stay. A handful of betas, a woman healer with hands that had tended both wolf and child, and, impossibly, a courier from a neighboring coven who had come with news and the smallest, most dangerous of smiles. "Tomorrow," the courier said softly, as if sharing a secret prayer, "the covens will ask for counsel. The watchers already stir. But tonight, blood keeps its own counsel." Garin nodded. He set the child's head against his chest and felt for the steady proof of life. The world beyond his date would demand explanations, trials, alliances reforged or broken. But in the thin, dangerous present, he had made a claim that would carry him across seasons. He would protect what his daughter had left, even if it cost him everything. Lucien stepped close and pressed his forehead for a moment to Garin's temple, a strange, intimate benediction that two wounded creatures could give one another. It was not romance as the clans told it, but it was a closeness born of sorrow transmuted into purpose. Garin answered with a simple squeeze of the hand, a promise without flourish. They would fight for the child. They would break treaties to fashion new ones. They would call witches and confront covens and drag the old bargains into sunlight. There would be losses, perhaps even the price Lucien had hinted at paying. Yet, as dawn gathered like a pale bruise on the horizon, Garin understood that the true sacrifice had been nothing dramatic at all. It was the laying down of a lifetime of solitary authority in favor of shared guardianship. It felt, to his surprise, like a kind of love. The first pale light touched Marissa Stone and warmed the carved letters. Garin breathed the river air and smelled, beneath the old iron and lavender, the faint, stubborn scent of forgiveness. He lifted the child so she could see the sunrise, and she opened her mouth as if testing the world. Between the two of them, an alpha and a vampire, knotted by grief and choice, something fragile and incandescent had been claimed. They would see the cost. They would bear it. For now, beneath the waking moon, they kept the promise they had spoken with hands and blood, and the tremulous, ferocious grace of those who choose to love against history. Dawn broke slow and uncertain, like a promise tested by too many winters. The yard smelled of wet earth and the small tang of iron that followed violence. Yet beneath it all was something new, a faint sweetness Garin had not known his throat could hold. He sat on the low stone wall with the child asleep across his lap, Lucien beside him leaning back on his heels, both of them listening to the world rearranging itself at the edges. They had spent the night drafting the first, halting rules of a life that would refuse easy categories. Lucien would teach the child the night, how to walk the thin line between hunger and restraint, the names of old protections that were more like poems than laws. Garin would teach her the dawn, how to feed wolves, how to speak in council rooms without turning tenderness into leverage. The witch who had written clauses on the margins of treaties would be hunted. The covens would be petitioned and cajoled and, if needs be, forced into a reckoning under witnesses who remembered how to name things so they could not hide. There would be danger. Roland's exile would sear like a brand across the pack, and the steward's betrayal would ripple to men who kept their loyalty thin as gossip. Some of Lucien's kin would refuse any pact with Wolves. Some of Garin's would call his mercy madness. But in the quiet breath between the morning bells and the first calls to hunt, Garin felt the raw, honest certainty that this fracture could heal because it had been named. He set the child's hand against his cheek and felt the tiny pulse there, fierce and sure. She stirred and opened her eyes, still the old dark of Maurice, still the peculiar hunger that would need tending. But when she looked at him, it was not with the weight of lineage alone. It was with a small, fearless curiosity, as if she understood less of the treaties and more of the faces of the two men who had wrapped her in their danger. Lucien reached out and touched Garin's knuckles with a reverence that had nothing to do with politics. There was no page of parchment for what they had agreed. It was a quiet covenant written in early light and the language of hands. "We will teach her to choose," Lucien said, voice small and roughened by hope, "not to inherit our fears." Garin's laugh surprised him, soft, incredulous. He had been a ruler who measured seasons with the arc of his jaw. Now he measured them by a child's breath. "She will choose her own hunting," he said, "and if she wants a life where the moon is merely a lamp, then we will make it so." They rose together as the sun cracked the horizon, the first rays gilding Maurice's stone and the thin braid of moss that had claimed its edges. Lucien stepped forward and, with an awkward, human solemnity, knelt and laid a single white blossom on the grave, a wildflower that smelled like rain. Garin, for once, did not command ceremony. He stood by the stone and let the silence between them say what words could not. Behind them, the yard stirred. Healers preparing poultices, betas arguing and then beginning the slow work of mending. A few faces staying, some because of loyalty, some because curiosity had become a kind of love. The courier from the neighboring coven lingered, uncertain, and then offered a thin bow before turning back toward the road. Messengers would ride, deals would be spoken, and the old watchers would blink wakeful eyes. Garin felt the old map of his life redraw itself, not in rigid borders, but in loops, of protection, of return. He lifted the child so she might see the waking world. The sun painted her hair with the same pale fire that once lit Maris's shoulders, and the child laughed, a small, startling sound like water finding a gutter. Garin let that laugh catch him and pulled it into his chest as if it could become a remedy. Lucien watched them both, the old lines of his face softened by something like relief. "Whatever they ask of us," he said, "we keep her first." "Always," Garin answered. They walked from the grave together, the two of them, one who had ruled by teeth and law, the other who had lasted by shadow and memory, striding into a day that would demand more than either had planned to give. Between them, the child reached for both hands and filled the space where grief had once sat like a stone. The horizon leaned forward, and for the first time since Maris's name had been carved in granite, Garin believed the future might hold more than consequence. It might hold a kind of family forged not by pedigree, but by the perilous, luminous labor of loving.